Kia ora, ko whusmatau, nā mai ki te whare, welcome to the House. This Parliament has seen a lot of urgency and a lot of hard-fought bills. If a contentious bill is under urgency, and especially if it has skipped the select committees, then oppositions tend to dig their heels in. And the easiest place to do that is the debating stage called the Committee of the Whole House. In the committee stage, as it's referred to, unlike the reading stages, there are no strict time limits and amendments are allowed. If you have followed committee stages in the House, you will have noticed a lot of amendments being proposed, sometimes hundreds of them.
The question is that Camilla Bellich's tabled amendment to
Ricardo Menendez-Martin's tabled amendment to Arna Williams' tabled amendment to Clause 4, Dr Lawrence Unan's tabled amendments to Clause 4.
For a better understanding of those amendments, their purpose and the process, I met the clerk whose office wades through them all, makes sense of them, gives advice on them, and even helps write some. This man.
I'm Pav Sharma. I manage the House Office for the Office of the Clerk.
The main purpose, I suppose, of the House Office is to be the secretariat for the chamber, for the debating chamber, and all the papers that come and go and all the things that happen in that, right?
That's right, yeah. So our focus is ensuring that members have everything that they need to debate legislation, to debate other aspects of House business, to scrutinise the government's finances. It's the wide spectrum of business.
The time I really need to avoid popping in, because you're all absolutely frantic probably, is when there is a contentious committee of the whole House stage happening in the chamber, when you guys will be dealing with all of the amendment papers that are coming through.
Yeah, that's right. So it can get very busy. It can get a little bit tense in the House Office and in the chamber when we have a particularly contentious committee stage. One of the points of the legislative process is that bills should be able to be amended, that they're amendable. Ideally, a bill will start its legislative process in one way, and it will be improved as a result of the legislative process and come out a better, more fit-for-purpose piece of legislation.
Yeah.
And so one of the ways in which you can do that is by amending it.
So there are 5 stages normally that a bill goes through, 3 which are debate and 2 which are different kinds of committees. You've got the select committee where the public and experts of other kinds give input into the bill, and the committee suggests changes to the House to the bill. And then the committee of the whole House, which happens after the second reading, where the House as a whole can suggest amendments to the bill. That's the bit where you particularly get involved, right?
Yeah, that's right. So committee of the whole is essentially a big committee that takes place in the debating chamber. Any MP can participate in committee of the whole, and any member can propose an amendment to a bill. There's no limit on the number of amendments that they propose. It's quite common for the member in charge of a bill, often a minister, to propose amendments to their own bill. So this could be to fix up some inconsistencies, tidy up the bill itself, or to potentially introduce some new policy to the bill.
Yeah, some bills change quite markedly at that stage, at the penultimate stage of debating, don't they?
Yeah, there's 2 key types of amendments. Okay, so the first type is the amendment paper. So amendment paper is, if it's the member in charge of the bill, it's usually drafted by the minister's officials, so the Parliamentary Council Office. If it's an amendment paper for a non-minister, then that's where the House Office comes into play, and we will draft the amendments for the member based on their instructions. The great thing about an amendment paper is that it's printed in advance, it's published on the legislation website, it has its own unique number, so it's really easy to identify and to cite in debate.
Yeah, now they're the organised amendments. But then there's the amendments that happen on the fly, in the room, usually by the opposition.
Yeah, those are tabled amendments. When we are in the committee stage itself, we can be in the hours leading up to that committee stage, or even during the committee stage, processing tabled amendments. They can be typed out, or they can be handwritten.
Yeah.
They can be delivered to the clerk at the table in the chamber, or they can be delivered to the House Office. And the general principle is that if they are an in-order amendment, then they are voted on.
An in-order amendment, because there are rules for what's allowed in an amendment. Tell me about the rules for amendments and what falls in and what doesn't.
If we're looking at the standing orders, there's some broad guidance about what's an in-order amendment. So the standing orders say that the committee of the whole can make amendments that are relevant to the subject matter of the bill, that are consistent to the principles and objects of the bill, and that otherwise conform to the standing orders and practices of the House. So that's quite a high-level description of what's in order amendment. The default is that unless there's a good reason for an amendment to be ruled out of order, it should be voted on. One of the most common ways in which an amendment is ruled out of order is that it's outside the scope of the bill.
If anyone follows American politics, they're quite used to the fact that bills can become enormously large and cumbersome over there because anyone can add any kind of amendment about anything. You know, you can have a bill about, I don't know, soybeans, and it'll have something about housing or cars or something else added to it as an amendment, and it's perfectly allowed, which is, I think, completely insane. We do not do that here, right? That it has to be on the same topic within the ambit of the bill that's being discussed.
Yeah, so we've got some quite tight rules around what's an acceptable bill. A bill has to have a single subject area, and it has to have a focus, which means that you don't have these really big, disparate bills which you can throw all sorts of different provisions into. So the scope of the bill is really determined by how big is this bill at introduction and how much it does. So a really narrow bill is going to be much harder to amend than a wide-ranging amendment bill, for example. What we're considering there is how relevant is the amendment to the bill that's been introduced to the House.
Dr Lawrence Yunan's tabled amendment to Clause 5 to insert new sub-clause 4 is out of order as being outside the scope of the bill.
Nobody gets to find out whether an amendment has been ruled out until after the debating, right? When you come to vote.
Generally, that's the case. We do provide advice to members when they are discussing their amendments with us. We can provide advice to them which say, we think it's possible that this could be outside the scope of the bill or out of order for another particular reason. But ultimately, the decision on whether something is in order or out of order sits with the chairperson of the Committee of the Whole. So that's the Deputy Speaker or the Assistant Speakers. It's their sole decision. And as you say, most often members will find out whether an amendment is in order or out of order at the point of voting.
Yeah, although sometimes that's fine because sometimes MPs are just trying to filibuster and use up as much time as possible, and having an amendment that's going to be out of order eventually still gives you something to talk about along the way, which is sometimes the point.
I do have a few amendments to speak to, and the first one...
I mean, sometimes an MP would come to you and you would say, I'm not sure this is going to be in line. They'd go, I don't mind.
That sometimes does happen. I mean, I think it's important to note that there are different purposes for amendments.
Yeah.
So we've talked previously about the amendments that the member in charge of a bill is making. So that's to fix up some issues, potentially introduce some new policy. For an opposition member, yes, they may be putting up an amendment without necessarily an expectation that it's going to be agreed to, but that amendment in itself does serve a whole range of purposes. Yeah. So it's something that they can talk about in debate. It's also a really good way of signalling the opposition's different position to the government.
Yeah.
Okay, so it could be a different policy position. It could be that they would approach this issue from a completely different angle. It's also a way in which they can bring to the House's attention perhaps the interests of a community group or other party. So they're kind of almost using their representative function there by putting up an amendment. Amendments themselves serve a whole range of purposes. Yes, they do use up some House time, but they're an important part of the Committee of the Whole debate.
And I get the sense sometimes watching committee stages that sometimes opposition members are putting up amendments they genuinely feel will improve the bill without changing its policy necessarily, and try very hard to get the governing side to actually, go along with that and accept their amendment, which does sometimes happen.
It does happen. It happens on relatively rare occasions, and I think part of the reason for that is that the amendments are being put up in Committee of the Whole, and so there hasn't necessarily been the opportunity for maybe ministers and officials to assess those amendments to ensure that they are not going to cause unintended consequences, for example. That said, there are occasions where you do get that really good debate across the House. Opposition members are able to provide a good explanation of their amendment. They're able to persuade the minister that this is a good idea and that amendment is essentially adopted by the government and that change is agreed to.
Honourable Brooke Van Velden.
Thank you very much. In response to Camilla Bellich's tabled amendment to increase the timeframe to the 6th of June 2026, the government will not be supporting that.
When amendments are tabled, they come to you.
Yep. So we take the amendment and we read it really closely. We read it not in and of itself. We also read it in the context of the bill. So that relationship between the amendment and the bill itself is what's going to determine whether it's going to be in order or not. So yes, is it relevant to the bill? And is it consistent with what the bill's trying to do? So there are times when you have amendments that are relevant to the bill, but can still be ruled out of order. So a really good example of that would be an amendment that is inconsistent with the principles and objects of the bill, which is kind of a parliamentary phrase, but really it's talking about what's the overall intent or the overall thrust of the bill. You could, for example, have a bill which is increasing the number of district court judges. So an amendment that would reduce the number of judges is definitely relevant to that bill, but it's
heading in the opposite direction.
Exactly, completely different direction of travel. So that would be a relevant amendment which would still be out of order because it's inconsistent with the bill's intent or its principles and objects.
Okay. What other kinds of things are ruled out or spotted by you in the office that might not be right?
An amendment may not be what we say in the correct form of legislation. At a basic level, an amendment needs to make sense if it's agreed to by the House, and it needs to make sense in the context of the bill. So you can't just add some random words to the piece of legislation. You have to know where in the bill that amendment's going to go. It has to be a coherent amendment.
Right.
So if an amendment doesn't do that, it could be ruled out as not in the correct form of legislation.
So it's got to be written as if it was part of the bill and actually makes sense within the whole. There's a lot of amendments that come through that seem sometimes just humorous, actually, or trivial or silly or whatever, that are about the title of the bill, which is always the last thing that gets debated, the title and commencement clause.
I want to suggest another name change, which is the Employment Relations Pay Deductions for Wearing a Badge Amendment Act. And the reason I suggest that is because that's exactly what can happen as a result of this Act.
That's right, yeah. So we call those the preliminary clauses. It's the final debate in the committee stage usually. And yeah, absolutely right. It's common for members to put up
dozens,
lots of amendments on the title clause.
Yeah.
Opposition members have been doing this for many, many parliaments. It's a pretty common thing. Back in the day, we've had amendments which have described a bill as Orwellian or as betraying senior citizens. Lots of these amendments are an opportunity for opposition members to signal their dislike of a particular bill and
or just
their critique.
Incredibly sarcastic about it. The incredibly stupid way to improve inflation bill, something like that.
Exactly, yeah. They're quite good for us because we can rapidly see that they're going to be out of order because they're not necessarily a serious amendment or not an objective description of the bill.
Yeah. Are there any other kinds of ways that fall foul of the rules?
So sometimes an amendment will come later on in the debate and in the bill, and the committee has already done some voting. It might have dealt with, say, for example, part 1 of the bill, and it's made some decisions. And so those later amendments are inconsistent with the decisions that the committee's already made.
Because the bill's now changed.
Exactly.
And so it's no longer relevant. It would have been an hour ago, but things have moved on.
And I don't want to hear any more relitigations of Part 1 and Part 2. This is about title and commencement.
Yeah, exactly. So the committee has decided it wants the bill to be in a certain way, and therefore those amendments which are inconsistent with those decisions of the committee can't be voted on.
No, that makes sense. There is an advantage to having something voted on if you're trying to use up time in the House. If you're the opposition and you're filibustering, everything that gets voted on takes just a little bit longer, right?
It does, yeah.
Sometimes the House can spend an hour or two just going through all of the amendments.
That's right. So in New Zealand, we have party voting. It's pretty quick. You're looking at somewhere like 45 seconds for a particular vote. But if you've got over 100 amendments on a particular part of a bill, then you're looking at least an hour of voting, which can be a bit of a challenge for members because votes are taken in silence. But it is really important. It's a really important principle that members should be able to put up amendments and that every in-order amendment is voted on, that the committee does get that opportunity to make a decision on those amendments.
Because some of them actually do improve the bill. And the purpose overall is that whether or not you agree with the bill, you do try to make it the best law you possibly can.
Absolutely. So a key function for members of Parliament is that they are legislators, and when they're putting up amendments to the bill, they are quite often trying, as you say, to improve the bill.
That was Pav Sharma, who runs the House Office for Parliament Secretariat, the Office of the Clerk. I'm Phil Smith, and you've been listening to The House. E te whakaranga koe ki te whare. This program is produced with funding from Parliament's Office of the Clerk. Mā te wā.